fossil fuels haven't just been damaging the planet. Burning fossil fuels has been, a health challenge for decades. So along with carbon comes all of the bad things that I used to regulate. And if you can find a way to make that shift, it is not going to be by finding a place to bury the carbon in the ground.
Good evening and welcome to your library. I'm David Leonard, BPL President and moderator of our Public Conversation series. Tonight is the kickoff of our 4 Lowell Conversations this season under the theme of climate action, climate justice, and which we are calling You Are Here, Climate Change and What's Next. We are once again thrilled to be offering this series sponsored by the Lowell Institute and produced in partnership with the GBH Forum Network. For more information on supporting this and our other programs, please visit the BPL Fund at bplfund.org. Few logistics first. Tonight's program is indeed being offered both in person and online, and the recording will be made available following the program. We will run about 75 minutes, maybe up to 90 minutes tonight. The first part will be the conversation between myself and our esteemed guest. We have some questions queued up from the audience that we received during registration, and we will have time to take audience questions during the latter part of the program, both from our in-person audience as well as from our online audience as well. For those viewing online or viewing the recording later on, you may see supplementary information and links shared relevant to tonight's conversation. And now, given our topic, we'll begin with the brief BPL land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people. We recognize the devastating effects of settler colonialism on their communities and their contemporary presence, and we commit to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. Our inaugural guest for this series this year is Gina McCarthy. I will not read her entire and very extensive biography that is available on our website, but she has most recently been the first ever White House National Climate Advisor. She's a former US EPA Administrator and one of the nation's most respected voices on climate change, the environment, and public health. In 2013 to 2017, she was the Administrator of the US Environmental Protection Agency under President Obama. Previously, she was the Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection, developed the state's climate action plan, and one of my favorite names for an initiative, the No Child Left Inside initiative. She has also held senior positions in the administration of 5 Massachusetts governors. That tells you something about her ability to work across the aisle and with multiple political positions. Her Bachelor of Arts is in Social Anthropology and holds a joint Master's of Science in Environmental Health, Engineering, Planning, and Policy. Please join me in welcoming Gina McCarthy.
Thank you, David. It just means that I'm old when you read something that long. You could have figured that out, I would assume, unless the lights are off.
we think of it as experience. In getting to know our guests, we like to know their personal story before we get deeply into the more substantive topic. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you grew up and what attracted you to this field originally?
That's a good question. I grew up I was born in Brighton, St. Elizabeth Hospital, in case you couldn't have figured that out. My dad was just out of the Army, World War II times, and he got money to actually buy a house in Canton, Massachusetts, where I lived. for the next, 27, 28 years. I am the youngest of 3 girls, I think my mom was a really solid character, as was my dad. They made you do homework. They wouldn't let me watch TV after a certain hour, but I lied upstairs and could peek down through. So I watched when they weren't realizing it. I had a great upbringing in Canton. It was a small town, and it was growing then. But you know, I grew up at a time when pollution was terrible. I mean, if you live in Massachusetts and you used to go down around the Lowell area, and you'd see all of the pollution from industry there. You'd see the rivers running blue and green and red, and if you remember, the litter was terrible. It was just everywhere. And, you know, when I was an outside kid, you know, I think we all were at that age. You know, your parents kicked you out of the house at around 7 o'clock, and they'd be looking for you about 7 that night, trying to figure out if you're still alive and where'd you go. And, you know, to me, the outside was where I lived. I still go to Blue Hills to walk around. That's my place, because my dad, every Saturday, used to take every kid in the neighborhood and pile them in to our station wagon, and we'd go to Blue Hills, and we'd just run around like crazy people. And so I love the outdoors. I hated the pollution, and that's where it all came from. That's why I took the path that I took.
Yeah, I mean, we share, I think, maybe an Irish legacy or history in our families, given your name and given I grew up in Dublin, not in Massachusetts, and you know what you're saying reminds me of the fact that environmental issues when I was growing, it was air pollution, it was waters and rivers and lakes and maybe the ocean, certainly something about the ozone layer. Those were the topics which seemed to resonate, and then it's much later we get to the place where, oh my God, all of this stuff is much more interconnected, and the challenges that we face today.
Well, first of all, happy St. Patrick's Day.
All right, 2 days ahead of time, but yes, thank
Close.
you. Or tomorrow.
Hey, I start celebrating way ahead of time.
St. Patrick's Eve, perhaps.
Yeah, you're right. How I translated this was into what I wanted to do was, when I went to Tufts, I went there because they had an interdisciplinary program that recognized the interrelationships. You had to learn about housing, you had to learn about how community development worked. It personalized it, and I ended up doing a lot there on the health side, because to me, I was trying to figure out how you motivate people for change, and to me, health is it. You know, so I tried always to just sort of rack my brain about what I wanted to get done, but more so, what do you need to know to figure out how to change things? And really, social anthropology, which was my undergraduate degree, is still what I do for a living. Okay. There was no job opportunities at the time, so I had to actually get other degrees. Yeah. But to me, it's still about culture. It's still about connecting. And so that's why if you follow the career that I've had, it's really, there's no connecting line other than how do I get a good thing to happen by making sure that people will not just accept it, but understand that that thing should happen for their benefit.
Yeah, I definitely want to get to our current reality and look at that through what you've just described as the social anthropology lens. But maybe let's follow a little bit of your earlier career first. And you know, you've worked across state governments. You've taught at university. You've worked in the nonprofit policy space, in fact, do many of those things still. How does the work differ in these different arenas?
It is different. The first, I don't know how many, I first started working at a community health center to try to look at what populations are coming in and changes there. That was just a learning experience for me, though. But out of that, I jumped into being the first full-time public health agent in Canton. It was a big deal. My mother was very proud. I learned a lot with that job. It was great because it was so tangible. You'd go to the supermarket and people would stop you to tell you that the neighbor's septic system was overflowing. It was exciting work.
Well, it's hyper-local, right?
It is. It's great. But what, it just continued that ethos for me, that I really wanted to connect. And I've never been one to judge a person by their political affiliation. I refused to do that until I learned something. And so when it comes to, nobody, when you're in the town of Canton and have a problem like they think their drinking water is contaminated, they don't say, well, I'm a Republican or a Democrat. Right. You're just a human being. So it's humanizing those things that is what I've really done mostly. But honestly, I'll tell you about, I have worked for 6 governors. 5 of them were Republican. I was appointed by Governor Dukakis in his 2nd term. I ended up going there because I worked for, I got involved in a lot of things in the town of Canton. We had a cancer scare, we had a PCB contamination that was all over the news and worries about neighborhoods. So I started, it was right when regulations were coming into play at the federal level and you were translating them. Well, I kept running ahead of the translation of the regulations. Right. I kept saying, well, I'm not going to wait for that. I'm going to do a bylaw on how far a well needs to be from a septic system. I'm going to do that. And so I don't know whether I was noticed because I was a big pain in the butt or because I was being creative. But I got called by the state and said, if you're going to be doing all these things and calling us, why don't you come work? And I said, well, what do you want me to do? And they said, this god-awful job is what I took. It was called the Hazardous Waste Facility Site Safety Council.
Okay.
Now, that was, so it was a board that got created to actually just build hazardous waste facilities. Okay. Now, my thing was, why do we need hazardous waste? So I'm like, this is not good. So I ended up effectively, there was a proposal for an incinerator in Weymouth. That died a natural and timely death. And right after that, they said, will you please come and run the office? I said, I'd be happy to do that, but what I'll do is put it out of business because I'm going to rewrite the statute. And I did. And the governor did it. And so I actually went to work to run the toxic use reduction program, which is what I really wanted to do. And so all of the, and I'm just walking through this because I've met a zillion people along the way. But fundamentally, people care about their health and their families and their communities. Right. And if that can be the lens through which you work, I think you're much effective at making the change happen. And so, and all those governors were very different, but none of them denied climate change. Even Mitt Romney did not deny it. He questioned it in the end, but he didn't deny it. Right. But I left anyways and went to Connecticut, and it was great. I got the job in Connecticut for a very unique reason. The governor in Connecticut went to jail for corruption, and the lieutenant governor was this lovely woman who said, okay, if I'm stuck doing this, I'm canning all of the people that have these jobs, and I'm going to get a professional committee to evaluate the candidates. So I'm like, well, that's interesting, because in Massachusetts, I never would have gotten the job. They always hire at least at that point, hired political people. So I made it to the undersecretary level, and I ran all of the environmental policies. But I did not get the head job until I went to Connecticut.
Interesting. I mean, it sounds like you were able to progress because you were seen as being effective.
I was effective.
As opposed to being judged on the political basis
And
that we
I
get stuck in.
wasn't seen as somebody that provoked.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? So nobody was mad at me.
Say more about that, because I get the sense that
weird.
you have very strong opinions.
No, I do have very strong opinions, but I moderate them on the face of facts.
Yeah.
If I'm wrong, I'll revise what I think. But I think most of the time I do a pretty good job before I take a position in evaluating what it should be.
Right.
But the weird thing is that as long as you're upfront with people.
Yeah.
And you ask them, what do you hate about this idea? And you talk it through. And then when you do it, they can still hate it. But they've had their day to talk about it. Right. And so I do not rub anybody's nose in something they don't like. But I just try to explain that, the regulation says this. I got to do that. Right. The law says this. So that's my job. Those are what I have. That's what I have to do.
It also sounds like, certainly in the early days, now I want to get to the federal level in a second, but the early days, you're making it, this is how it relates to my home environment or my life or my family's life, and that's almost undeniable in terms of a motivator to act.
That's at least where I landed, and it's probably because for me that matters.
Right.
My family matters more than anything.
Right, right.
Mess with it, you're in trouble.
Noted.
I know. We are Irish. I mean, it's my family.
So how did those skills and that experience then translate at the federal level, which we perceive as being much more polarized and much more entrenched?
Well, here's where the difference comes from working for an NGO versus working for government. Yeah. And now I do some work with private companies on climate investment opportunities, because I want to get money into the developing world is my mission right now. And so the issue is that NGOs tend to approach the environmental stuff as always being very aggressive and, for the most part, confrontational. Yeah. There are others that aren't so much, but they do. In government, my job isn't to antagonize people or to cajole them. It's to say, this is what led to the law. This is what its intent is. Right. This is what my job is, and these are the parameters for doing it. Now, there's lots of flexibility on how to make that happen, and I'll take the best from everybody's judgment on that. So when and I did somewhat that was relevant on the state level, but the federal level, that's everything. Yeah. So it's grown increasingly, as difficult in Washington to get anything done in Congress with the polarization between Republicans and Democrats now. But I went to hearings and I sat there. I took the abuse. I didn't swipe back. I said, they asked me a question. I answered it, maybe not to the best of my ability, but the smartest way I knew how. Right. Which is to not say anything that I don't want to say, because then you'll open up another can of worms. And so it's sort of a process that you learn, but I've been much more comfortable in the government arena than I am in the NGO. And I don't want to, and I don't mean to, paint them with a broad brush. I did work as president and CEO of the Natural Resources Defense Council. That's a different game, but I was never really comfortable in the position of just trying to be as annoying as I could be to make the issue hit the newspapers. It's just not where my head is at.
And you have many firsts in your career. The most recent one being the first climate advisor on the national matters for the White House. What was that like to get that call? I mean, you'd worked in the Obama administration, obviously,
yeah.
and then you get a call, and we'd like you to do this.
Well, President Biden had worked in that administration too, so we knew each other.
Yeah.
You know, and he's just a wonderful person. I respect him tremendously. The problem I had was that at NRDC, I had just been there a little less than a year when I got that call.
Right.
And I'm like, this is the first time in my entire life that I've ever made any money. And I had just told my husband, don't worry, hon, you can retire, because his business, where he worked, it's not his business, where he worked wanted him to start taking more risks under COVID than he was willing to take. So I'm sitting there going, okay, I just told my husband to retire, which he did, and now I'm leaving a really, for me, really lucrative job. Right. So I'm like, why did I answer the phone? But you know, when that call comes, you do it. Right. And so I had done earlier work in the campaign. Because the president had pulled together some groups to help establish his platform. Yeah. And I was part of the group that looked at climate, as was John Kerry and a whole bunch of other folks. And it was so, I knew I knew how aggressive he wanted to be on climate. So it was way too enticing. Right. You know, because I might have said yes if I didn't think he was the person to really start acting in a really aggressive way, because that's what I wanted to do.
Well, thank you for your service in that respect, and for saying yes. I think we're better for it. So maybe let's turn to how are we doing? You know, and I think you know, we could start locally and think about Boston. We can think about the region. Because climate doesn't adhere to state borders or other borders. It's a regional issue. But I also want to think how we're doing globally and how we're doing as a species. So, but maybe let's start with.
Do we start at the bottom and work our way up?
Either way.
Yeah. Well, I've been really active on climate in Massachusetts for a long time, and that activity has not stopped. Right. And so Massachusetts is doing really well. I think the climate law that was passed in 21 was really aggressive. And I think Governor Healy, who called me like 2 days after I left the White House and said, Gina, will you do the climate plan? And I'm like, oh, no. But I did. We did it with a bunch of people. It was a great experience. But she's really gung-ho. She's smart. She's aggressive. So I think Massachusetts has been able to hold its own on all of these conversations for a long time, and has a lot to be proud of. And I think Mayor Wu's very good in the city of Boston, and she's looking to do more. It's one of her big 3 things she wants to get work done on. So I don't think there's anything for us to, you know, be disappointed with in terms of the performance of the state. Regionally as well, we're not doing bad. Right. You know, I helped to design and get implemented the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. I started it when I was in Massachusetts and ended it, and really started it, signed it into law, regulation in Connecticut. And so New England's working together. We're making the shift. There are challenges, but you know, we're eyes wide open. Right. We don't close our eyes ever here. You know. Right. So I think we're doing okay. You know, some other states are doing really well. I would characterize that as probably less than 20. But you've got a lot of states that really are not making the progress that we'd like them to make towards renewable energy and facing some of the challenges that they need to face even on just traditional water and sewer.
Now, do you think there are common elements as to why that is the case? Is it part of the over-reliance on fossil fuels? Is it, you know, the denial component, or the, you know, I don't understand it, therefore I don't want to deal with it, or it's too big and I don't want to deal with it, or it's become a political issue, and so I'm really afraid of change, but it's a democratic issue, and therefore I don't want to. Like, what is your sense, having worked in this space, of why other states or other areas aren't at least more like Massachusetts or New England, even though there are some problems here that we should get to as well?
I mean, you're talking about a multi-dimensional issue. I mean, clearly politics plays into it, but you know, they wouldn't be taking those positions if they didn't think that the majority of people would keep them there in politics. And so a lot of states have extreme poverty.
Yeah.
And I think that's one good reason to worry about whether or not they want to talk about climate change.
Because there are more urgent issues to focus
on? Don't
on?
you think?
Right.
You know, and if they think they're going to lose their job, or if somebody in labor thinks they're going to lose their job, so there's heavy industry in places that will challenge that question. Are they going to be putting my job at risk? Right. You know, and will I start having to pay more money for my electricity or energy? You know, all those things factor in among many issues. And so I think you could debate a long time about what's the most prominent. But and the other is that climate has been a heavily funded campaign by the fossil fuel companies to discredit the science for years and to try to explain to people why fossil fuels are necessary and why everything else is potentially disbenefiting all of them, knowing the vulnerabilities of the people they're talking to. So there's been a concerted campaign by those who might see themselves on the losing side of climate, which frankly should be nobody. And that's, I think that's the challenge.
You know, although we hear many of the larger traditionally fossil fuel driven companies have a green dimension or have investment in renewables, is that marketing, or is that just not enough, or you know, do you have a sense of how real this transition is truly becoming? And I think thinking about this as transition from one source of fuel to another, more than giving something up, could be a better way of framing the issue.
I think there's, you know, we talked about this a little bit. I think if you really want to take care of climate change, you either have to do both supply and demand side, right? Right. And demand is where President Biden has put his stock in trade. Okay. Mainly, or at least a big factor in that, is that the United States laws around fossil fuel development are difficult, and challenges to those go to courts that are very difficult. So it's hard. Legally, it's difficult, but on the demand side, it's different. And here's why what I just mentioned matters a lot in terms of understanding of how clever the structure of that we were trying to put in place to reduce demand really was. And it was clever because it wasn't a climate strategy, it was an economic development strategy. It was a we need more jobs strategy. It was an equity strategy. How do we get to those communities left behind? So it was not translated as the planet is in trouble strategy. It was you're personally in trouble. And our economy is. Our path forward is this. So then you make the flip to the supply side, And there were the challenge with the fossil fuel companies is that I mean, you can't paint any sector with a broad brush, but if their entire product line is selling fossil fuels, I don't know how to green that.
Right.
And and the problem that I have with all of these that just look at carbon is that fossil fuels haven't just been damaging the planet. Burning fossil fuels has been, a health challenge for decades. So along with carbon comes all of the bad things that I used to regulate.
Right.
And if you can find a way to make that shift, it is not going to be by finding a place to bury the carbon in the ground.
Right.
That's just not what I think takes care of the fossil problem.
Or plant more trees as compensation.
I think that's part of the dynamic of the problem right now, why carbon credits are challenging and why countries are really struggling to know what to do here. It's the fact that they are only thinking in a framing of climate, not in a framing of, I can make an economic transition that's meaningful for the health and well-being of my country. I can provide us a stable economy. Maybe I can even get stable government if we continue with that for a while.
Right.
And that's how you have to think of the problem. Right. Don't just sell it that way, but that's the solutions you have to put on the table, which is why it's so ludicrous to have fossil fuel companies, be out there with such weak climate guarantees, but neglecting the fact that fossil fuel itself is the problem. Now, that doesn't mean I'm crazy enough to think that we should give up people's energy and electricity by turning the spigots so fast, but I do think if you can increase demand exponentially, which is frankly what we were trying to do with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the IRA and others, if you can do that, you will start a ball rolling that I have every expectations will grow larger.
And an advocacy, I think, for a staggered transition. I think one of the clear ways in which, on a global scale, this has become illustrated has been the European dependence on Russian supply that has come to light because of the war in and on Ukraine. And so maybe we can take the conversation to a little of the global concerns, which are also equitable. About equitable investment and equitable recovery and climate justice, not just climate change. So from your position at the White House, tell us a little bit about your sense of global progress or lack of global progress. I mean, in 2015, you had that great piece on some of the global conferences. A lot has happened since then, and a lot has not happened since then.
Yeah. I think right now it's very challenging. I don't want to sugarcoat any of it. I just think it's really challenging. There's just, when you think about the challenges that we talked about poverty and other things in the U.S., you magnify that by 200% or more. And then you're dealing with countries that are struggling to sort of get food on the table for people. And so that's why there must be a strategy that connects all of those things. And the challenges, and I don't want to say we're running out of time, but we're running out of time. We simply are. I don't think that motivates people to act, to be honest with you. Because it never does. Well, I don't know if you've had teenagers, but you're going to miss the bus. Yeah, whatever. You know what I mean?
Let alone
we're talking about
Al
the Earth
Gore's
here.
Inconvenient Truth, and that was the gloom and doom movie that turned the corner. But
it was. It made it a very visible problem. But I think the more we can talk about the solutions, the better. And it's difficult for a number of reasons. A lot of countries have done a good job at putting in what they call NDCs, which are basically, what's your path to net zero?
Yeah.
But then wars come out, then fossil fuel goes away, so this life happens outside that venue, and it gets very difficult. And right now, the fun thing about the COP in Egypt, the Conference of the Parties in Egypt is an annual climate conference, and it was in Egypt. It was the first time it was in Africa, and honestly, the entire place was abuzz because it was all of the developing countries that took the floor and for the first time spoke for themselves, right? And so there was a big debate about reparations, and it ended up being pledges for loss and damage funds, which is good. It made progress, but we committed to money that Congress won't give. It simply will not approve that.
So that then is a promise without any ability to deliver on it.
And I think that that might happen with others.
Yeah.
So I guess the end result is that for me, I don't spend a lot of time dwelling on fossil fuels because I can't fix it other than sideways.
Yeah. Right.
I have to go at it in a different way.
Right. Before we turn to the questions that we got from the audience at registration and then open it up, you've also written that about you consider yourself an optimist, despite this particular topic being, existential and being a threat. Tell me about your optimism and what keeps you going and why is it the better approach?
Because I think it might work.
Okay.
I guess I absolutely am an optimist. I see change happening.
Okay.
Now, you ask me right now, we're in a very difficult place right now. But I think it's difficult for a reason. The carbon credit system has been broken.
Right.
So there's a log jam with resolving that, which I trust will be resolved in a few months, maybe September. That's at least
I love the pun on that, by the way, log jam with carbon credits.
So that should resolve itself, and then I think you'll see some real significant investment flowing into the developing world. The thing that I and this is where my social anthropology comes in, is just, even with my, let me do the social anthropology part. The only thing that worries me about all of this is that a lot of investments are going in for very large scale change. That was how we have grown as a country, not necessarily how those countries want to grow. So I'm doing a fellowship at Tufts, which I just signed on for. It's unpaid, that's how things go. But I didn't want to get paid because I wasn't sure how much time I could commit to it, but I love it. It's a climate policy lab. They actually do net zero plans for countries, working with the countries in the countries. So that's what I want to see. I don't want our answers to be invested in and forced to other countries so that you can give them 2 or 3% of the revenues.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Right. I think as we were talking, that the worst of that model is, U.S. companies doing things in other countries around the world in order to solve their own profitability problems, not to solve the actual underlying
That's exactly
issue.
right. That's exactly right. And I don't want to fix India's, problem with food by creating a system that ships the food to every other country using industrialized agriculture and fertilizer. You know what I mean?
And fossil fuels to power the transit system.
Exactly, that's what it is. And so it's difficult. But I also have made, but things are changing, and I have been optimistic the whole way because I see the change. I mean, really, if you were around early in climate, you were kind of treated as a wacko, right? And I remember the ozone layer. It was a disaster until it wasn't. There have been many great solutions that have been brought to very difficult problems. Now, this is the most difficult, without question. But if you start getting negative, you have to be realistic when you ask a question of things going well. Not that well right now. But I will bet you in a year from now that things will change dramatically. Because I'm going to make that bet because I don't believe that by being negative, you actually generate any energy for change to happen. I think it's just the opposite. I mean, I can't stand people who just think the worst all the time. Just drives me absolutely out of my mind.
Get more with honey than vinegar.
Well, I had 3 children in 3 years, right? And so you just had to figure out the personality of each of those 3 kids to figure out how you, as a teenager, you'd get them up in time for school. That was the analogy I was going to talk about. And honestly, my younger daughter would get up. My oldest is a son. He would hate it and grumble, but he'd get up. My middle daughter, it needed to be an enticement. Interesting. And I learned from that you need to craft everything into a yes that would otherwise be a no, because you just won't win. You will not win. People don't act like that. They love to get benefits. We are certainly not in a position to take more pain on countries that need that investment the most. And so we have to go in with ears wide open, understanding what's best, what they think is best for them. And there's a lot of countries now in Africa that are actually designing their own net zero plans. And if you can get investments that actually do implement those plans, you should give them 3 times the carbon value.
And so your work in this fellowship, is that largely with countries in what we might have called the developing world, or is now the global south?
Yeah, global south,
okay. Good.
Yeah, it's exclusively there.
So which in itself is an equity play. It's about rebalancing some of the injustices of the past.
And the investment companies that I'm consulting with and advising, similarly, that's where they're investing.
Great. Let's turn to a few of the questions that we got ahead of time. And for our audience, both in person and online, please be thinking of the question that you would like to ask, and we get to those in a few minutes as well.
Feels like nobody's even moved. Can't hear anything.
It's a great conversation so far.
Mesmerized, yeah. Asleep? Is that another AKA asleep?
So this first question I'm going to take relates, I think, probably to some of your earlier work around with the EPA roles, but also applies today. Where do you see the role of water resources in tackling and adapting to climate change?
Yeah, it is a monumental challenge in the U.S. right now. And in other countries, the thing that worries me the most is that in the global south, is what I probably should say, is they're basically building lots of solar arrays, which is great, renewable energy, but they don't have clean water or clean sewer. I do not know how you build an economy without fundamental infrastructure, and that's a challenge. Now, in terms of water resources in the U.S., the Colorado River is running dry. Does that give you a clue? You know, the challenge out west right now is too little water. right as we speak, the Department of the Interior has, for the second time, told the states that have the compact of how to use water in the West and how it's allocated.
Anyone drawing water from the Colorado River watershed.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they have to rethink it.
Right.
Or DOI will have to do it. The Department of the Interior will have to do it, because these are actually legal, solid commitments.
Right.
And the problem is that you have, areas out west that are running dry, and you have other states that just keep building more communities to send water to. That does not really exist for them. Right. And it's an enormously challenging issue. It's one that I saw really clearly early on, because when you're doing climate in the White House, you get a call, and in the Klamath River Basin there's a tension there. They're afraid that the farmers are going to start yelling at the real estate people, and there's going to be, I'm like, oh my goodness, it's amazing. It's enormously challenging in some areas of the country, and then in others, you just have too much water. But the interesting thing that I think I've recently seen is in California, they finally figured out. I shouldn't say that. That sounds rude, like I figured it out ages ago. They have figured out that part of the problem is not having too much or too little water. It's you have such heavy flows. And they're not storing it.
Like the rainfall.
They're not figuring it out. The rainfall would be fine. But they're drawing from Colorado because there's no plan for what to do with the excess water that simply just gets soaked back into the earth. So that's kind of interesting. I wonder what's going to happen.
Other examples in the water resources, the Flint, Michigan situation, or any of our oceans around our coast.
Flint, Michigan was really about it's complex. It was about water quality, but it was about water quality because they were drinking dirty water and they weren't treating it. And they did that without telling anybody in the community. And it's a community that was something like 300. They had big manufacturers, GM, 300,000, and they now have 90,000, something like that. So you can't run a water system designed for 250,000 people and have it go to 90,000 and work.
Right. These things are all interconnected.
This is all connected. This is, again, just about poverty and equity. Nobody ever would have been able to do that if those two factors weren't underlying that decision.
The next question I'm going to take relates to, I think people are critical of this work because either they don't understand it and think it's too interfering, or they're critical because we're not fixing things fast enough, right? So this question
When you say this work, what work are we talking about?
The work of protecting the environment, of greening our world and our infrastructure and our systems. The question is, how can local government best be a proponent of Green New Deal policies and initiatives while also criticizing and challenging what both state and federal governments are too slow to adopt or implement? So this seems to me to be, if we were to take Boston as an example, and Mayor Wu has certainly made commitments on Green New Deal policies, which our new governor appears to be consistent with. But at the same time, these things are all connected. How do we advance while at the same time being able to call out those that aren't moving fast enough?
Well, I'm a believer in bottom-up change. I did go to the federal government, I'll admit that. But I was a regulator when I went there, which gave me I liked it. It was really good.
So regulator is a good word
EPA.
then.
Regulator is a great word for me. Yeah, it's great. But local communities for a very long time drove the climate agenda.
Yeah.
They were the one creatively thinking about small businesses and what kind of change we do. I've never seen change from above go down that actually worked, in my opinion. And so I think that local communities have a lot of ways in which they can be active on climate. And it's not just recycling, but it should be recycling. You know, let's stop dissing recycling like it's a moron, it's moronic. It's not, it's fundamental.
Right.
It's a thing you can do what you can do.
Could we do it better?
Oh, that's what I'm saying, we should, yes, yes, we should. We should go back to doing that a lot better than we do now. But they can also, one of the big things that we dwelled on was the federal government and state governments have a lot of ability to do things, but in some cases it's local.
Yeah.
It's buildings.
Yeah.
It's what kind of building standards you create.
So,
that's uniquely local or state.
So when I go home, I should rethink, okay, let's make sure the house is insulated. If I can do solar, do that. Yeah. Sort the recycling. Yeah. Those kind of things, change my energy provider.
But for
perhaps.
The most part, there's been very little money dedicated to these efforts. And so I think what I really need you to take home, and this is optimistic, but it's right, is that the money in the Investment Reduction Act, that is that what it's called?
Inflation.
Yeah,
right.
oh my God, isn't that awful?
That was
Inflation,
Freudian.
yeah. The IRA. I hate the IRA. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. I told them when they did this bill, I'm like, why did you call it that? But anyway, sorry, I knew you'd get a kick out of
comment.
That. I'm like, seriously. But that's almost $370 billion in investments. Right. And the vast majority is to actually develop the kind of infrastructure you need for a changing climate. It's all about renewable development. It's all about electric vehicles. It's all about homeowners getting access to resources to be able to do the kind of work that'll lower their energy bills. And they can get a boost by the federal government. And the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is all about water, wastewater, chemicals. It's all about building the EV charging stations. So, I mean, you're talking, that's over $1.2 trillion. So we do have an opportunity to advance at the local, state, and federal level, the kind of change we want. And I just read an analysis today, a new analysis, because they keep getting better, which is why I like to quote them, that we could almost get to 80% reduction if we can spend that money quickly and get it into action. That's the big if. Okay. And that's the challenge.
So don't worry so much about what can't happen over the next 2 years. Let's focus on executing the things that have gotten approved in the last two.
That's right. Okay. And let's not be parochial about it. Let's be generous about what needs to get done. Okay. It may not be perfect, but it will make huge change. Yeah.
Great. If we could have the house lights up, we'll look for questions from our in-person audience as well as from online. Please don't speak until we have the microphone come to you so that those who are joining us online can hear the question and the answer. So we'll take Chu here to start with, and then we'll see if there's an online question next. And I have a couple I've left in reserve just in case. So please go ahead.
Thank you. A question, could you talk about the role of private capital in galvanizing support and kind of furthering these initiatives that are critical? The government's laid the table to some degree. What role will private capital play?
Yep. Well,
and you have experience because you were part of an investment firm.
Yeah, I've been working with a couple of investment firms now. It matters a lot. But, private capital needs signals, right? It needs to know that it's investing in the right things moving forward. That's one of the reasons why the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the IRA was so important. It sends a very clear signal about where change is going to make. And I know that everybody's going to say, oh, yeah, but those Republican states are not going to do anything. I'm sorry, but you're wrong. Because these are fundamental benefits for their constituents. So when we put out we had to states had to submit plans, I'll speak clearly, states had to submit plans for how they would use money to build the EV infrastructure that they were going to get. They literally had to, and they were multifaceted. There were lotteries on how many would actually submit. 50 submitted them. And they were legitimate applications. So don't, we have to stop this idea that brings a negative to the most positive thing we could possibly think of. So I think private capital is going to be the driver of this change. This thing is an enticement for private capital. And private capital really has been the underpinning, and I should probably not get too far because of silicon, but has been the underpinning for the new technologies that we're now not thinking of as new anymore.
Well, regulated managed investments should not have the problems that we had over the weekend. So,
that's correct.
So there is that approach. And I think we've seen in other sectors where people may object to the policy discussion or the policy positions, but aren't going to leave their state or their community behind when there's money on the table. Let's take the second question here. And we'll go to you and you after we take an online question. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so after about 6 years hiatus, I'm back in the Environmental Affairs Department at an organization that I'd like to leave nameless, but then I wouldn't be able to answer my question. I'm going to ask my question. And that organization is the MBTA. So having said that, and also I want to emphasize I really was a glutton for pain because I actually read for the second time Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. But
read Sense of Wonder. Read her book, Sense of Wonder.
Okay, good.
It'll make you feel better.
Okay, thank you for the advice. I really appreciate that. Having said that, what do you think is the role of public transportation in fighting climate change?
Well, I live in Jamaica Plain, and I actually live in the old. Oh, I shouldn't tell people where I live, should I? I might have said something that really ticks them off. So I won't. But I live very close to the Jamaica Way.
Okay.
Ha! Seriously? Yeah. You can't get around this city. I think public transportation is hugely important in making this transition. And not just local, not just in the city or in the area, but regionally. The whole line, the whole railroad line between here and down south has to be upgraded. It's just ridiculous. But anyways, yes, I think MBTA is really important. I appreciate the work they did on the Orange Line and the new cars. I like the design of the new cars. That was it. That's all I have to say.
It's a process, right?
Well, I mean, it's just they've been disinvested in for so long, and that's true of government writ large.
Well, what do you think about? I don't have the microphone. I'm sorry.
And then we'll move.
Okay.
So
what do you think about Mayor Wu's concept about fare free transportation?
Sounds good, doesn't it?
I mean, I think it's possible. I really do. I think we have to think in those grand terms if we're going to get people out of cars. I really do. I don't think we're going to get people out of cars unless we make it attractive.
And the other thing, I think the other thing is that there's a lot of people that rely on the public transportation, and many of them don't have money to throw around on that. So it would be a big equity boost for this city.
Thank you. Do we have an online question teed up?
I agree, one of our attendees writes, I agree that the essential goal is to convince people that environmental issues are key to their prosperity and those of their children. But our citizens seem to be convinced that the accumulation of wealth is the goal and that environmentalism will keep them from doing that. How do you convince them of the fallacy of that position?
Can I just say, and I don't want to be mean to somebody I'm not looking at, but I don't necessarily agree that the accumulation of wealth is what keeps everybody happy, or is people's goals in life. I've made lousy choices if that's the case.
Are you happy?
Yeah. I am. So I just, the premise of that I find difficult, but I do not, I think the problem that is being identified in that question is that people think that change is too expensive. People think that climate is too expensive, so they'd rather not make that transition. But the truth is that it's exactly the opposite. We're already spending more money because of climate change. We're already losing more people's lives. We're already have health challenges that we've never had before. So you got to look at that underlying premise that says that climate change is too expensive to fix. It's frankly the only thing that's going to allow us to have generations to come.
Maybe it's too expensive not to fix.
Yeah, that's the issue.
Okay.
I should have just said that. It would have cut down on my rhetoric.
Teamwork in the conversation. We'll go to two more in person. There's one in the middle I had, and then we had one up on the left-hand side. And then we'll go back to it online if there's another question.
You have your trustee right there.
Okay, hi.
Thanks for the lecture so far. It's been really great. But my question is, how do you see the role of regulation in actually being a barrier to some new climate technology or climate movement? There's a lot of long-standing regulations that kind of won't budge for very good reasons, but it's also coming into conflict with new ideas and innovations and protecting and preparing for climate change.
I have seen many of those, and I don't like them. You know, that is the challenge with regulation. If it's not properly implemented, and it's not implemented with the right creativity, you're in a lot of trouble. And frankly, I've seen that happen. Not as much, well, maybe somewhat at the state level, but a lot at the federal level. There's a lot of independent agencies that make very interesting decisions, in quotes. And so there's two things to think about with regulation. It should be revisited often. I'm not suggesting that it should expire at given points in time, but it has to be revisited. There also has to be a governance structure that holds people accountable in government. You know, I don't think there's a lot of that, frankly. People don't like to challenge other people's decisions, but there needs to be, in every agency, there needs to be solid ways of questioning and looking during the draft process, during the design process. I was a nutcase at EPA. I let nothing go that I won't say I read them all. If you've ever read an EPA rule, God, 20 pages, you'll die. You know what I mean? But I engaged in I think almost every regulatory decision that was made to ask questions and to figure it out. What's the good? What's the bad? How do we make an adjustment? When do we have to look at this again? That kind of thing. The other side of the regulation question, and I'm beginning to think I shouldn't say that, it's a legitimate concern, is that the adoption of regulations at the federal and state level and at the local level can make really good things impossible to do, or too slow for private investment to want to take a chance on. That's the big challenge with the IRA. The Inflation Reduction Act is all about getting projects moved, all about getting money to communities that didn't have it. If this becomes an issue where we'll fight every single step of the way because it's not my perfect answer, then we will have lost every opportunity, you know? And so we have to relook at the way in which we've taken really long time to make decisions. I'm not suggesting you don't look at the environmental consequences, but if you have to take 2 years to do every permit, you will not be able to expend this money in a timely way, and we'll lose huge opportunities.
Great.
So we got to do something.
We'll go to the back, and then we'll go online, and then we'll come over to down front.
Thanks so much for your remarks, Administrator McCarthy. I guess I was curious about the Justice 40 initiative,
Yeah.
and would love to hear your thoughts about how it's gone so far and what you really would like to see it deliver in these next 2 years.
Justice 40 is about making sure that 40% of the investments that we're making on climate actually get to the communities that have been underinvested in and underserved. So it's a great initiative. There's now a brand new what do they call it, office within EPA that's headed by somebody that I worked with who's terrific. And it has more money than they've ever seen before, frankly, at EPA to make sure that these investments are tracked, to actually do upfront work to get projects into these communities, to engage the communities directly before they're confronted by all these brilliant ideas. And so I think it's going well. And I know that I work on the board of a couple of nonprofits who are really working hard to help build up the technical capacity in environmental justice communities, in communities that really have never had the opportunity to engage and to figure out how they can help provide help for that, both upfront capacity building as well as help with the review of different types of proposals and opportunities. So we all know it's the right thing to do, but again, it's not easy to build these systems at the federal level. So a lot is still going to be up to NGOs to be watchdogs over this, which they're very capable of doing, and to also use money that they gather to actually help with building that infrastructure, because it's going to be hard to spend this kind of money in this short period of time and track to make sure it's going to the best locations where the benefits are the highest.
Thank you. We'll take another online question.
One of our attendees online asks, how do we as individuals persuade doubters about the need to act on climate change? I don't face a lot of people anymore that don't believe in climate change, and I go a lot of places. So I don't think that's the fundamental challenge. Again, what I would do is to talk to them about the solutions to climate and what they could access themselves and why it would be beneficial to them. I think arguing about climate change is just not the thing to do. But you can, there's plenty of, and I'm sure you have links to these, there's plenty of great science on this. But I think the challenge really is to say that a change to address climate change would be enormously beneficial for them and their families, not to mention that it really is an existential challenge.
We have a question from our chair of our Board of Trustees, Priscilla Douglas.
Thank you so much for being here. I sincerely appreciate your combination of tenacity, optimism, and wisdom.
Thank you.
My question has to do with putting on your global hat. I'm concerned about people being displaced because of climate change. I know about with food and famine and people moving. Can you, from your point of view, talk about where people are being displaced and where are they going?
Yeah. That's a haunting problem. We have tribal nations up in Alaska that are being moved because their reservation is no longer livable. You know, they're along the coast. But you also have the movements from basically the extreme storms that we're seeing and the extreme heat. And so what I try to remind people when they think of this is that there's a lot of people concerned about the immigration that we're seeing and how much. If you track that back, you will see that they're leaving places where they can't grow food anymore and they can't feed their families. What would you do? Would you stay there and say, you know, I really like my home and I'm not going to bother everybody else? If you track back where all these things are happening, many of them, it's because it's been a change in their environment that is a result of climate change. And now we're seeing extreme heat that is just a killer, both in the US and in other countries. And we have to try to figure out how to accommodate that, how to deal with that, how to make sure that we're considering these, especially for the elderly. But some of the temperatures we're seeing in other countries are phenomenal, and people are leaving. They can't breathe under those conditions. So we're seeing a lot of people, you know, basically trying to emigrate somewhere else and be assimilated in. And I frankly don't think that there's anything wrong with that. And I think the challenge really is to get these countries, all these countries working together to address this challenge. So it's a terrible situation.
Okay, we have 2 more questions up above, and we'll go back to online
In particular,
as well.
I started to go nutso about Honduras, is what I would tell you. I was reading, so you asked me to name a specific place. It was awful. It was heartbreaking. And then you go to Africa and you see whole countries in a way that has never happened before. And the flooding in Pakistan, I mean, seriously? That poor country? So, I'm sorry, now I'm dwelling. Yes?
Yes. Meat and dairy production both use a lot of energy and water, and cows burp out methane every year to the tune of 100 kilograms per cow. They also drink 30 to 50 gallons of water per day, and that can go up to 60 to 100 on a very hot day. And in California, about half of the state's water supply goes to the beef and dairy industry, and this doesn't get enough attention. And you mentioned how the West is drying up, and sorry, I don't know the exact figures, but I do know that meat and dairy farms are using a lot of the Colorado River's water. So, are there any initiatives at the EPA to encourage people to decrease meat and dairy consumption and eat more plant-based foods as a way of fighting climate change and conserving water as well as land?
Yes, I mean, I think the health aspects are what's focused on at EPA. What's happening in the Inflation Reduction Act is that there's $6 billion, I think it is, that's dedicated towards regenerative farming, or how should I say it, more sustainable farming. I think what I'm seeing in other countries is a lot of shift towards regenerative farming. Now, that doesn't say much about the points you are making on livestock, but that's what I know about. It is really, in California, I think it's 50% goes to agriculture. Some of that may be livestock, but a lot of it is like almonds, seriously, which use huge amounts of water. So I think there's a lot of education happening on food. There's less focus on cattle and other livestock.
Yeah, I just have one addendum to that you mentioned about the almonds.
Yeah.
I do know when I don't know exact for the past year or two, but it was about 10 years ago that almonds were using 12% of California's water supply. The beef and dairy industry was using 47%, and the alfalfa industry was using 15%, which alfalfa is naturally consumed by cattle. So
I see.
the almonds, in comparison, were using a tiny percent of the, much, much, much less than the cows and the alfalfa that they consume. In fact, almond farmers have decreased their water footprint by using drip irrigation and so on in the last few years. But
You know way more about this than I do.
Okay, sorry, but there's really no way you can do that with beef and dairy because animals have to eat and drink water. So that's why if we really want to fight climate change, we really have to decrease meat, dairy, egg, and fish consumption.
I don't disagree with you, but that's an area where, remember we talked about, is it the supply or demand? You know, it has to be the demand side.
Yeah, I mean, there's a meta point here, I think, about that we need a holistic approach to the interconnectedness, and that's the evolution in our thinking that maybe is different than you know, the 30 or 40 year. So thank you for your input. There was one more question up there, and then we'll see if we can get one or two more in, but we are going to start drawing things to a close. So
is it on? Yeah. Thank you so much. You've had a very, I'm here.
yeah.
Oh, thank you, I couldn't see you.
You've had a very successful and inspiring career. I also appreciate that you find yourself as an optimist, but I have to admit I find myself more so on the pessimistic side. And I'm curious on your advice for young people. I see quite a few youthful faces in the room. So I think I find myself in a position that I'm not in a decision-making position in my company, in a nonprofit, in a government sense. They're not really giving 23-year-olds the power to make the decisions that need to be made. So it's difficult when you find yourself in this position of you just have to wait and hope that someone else is making the decision. What advice do you have for us on the role young people can play and how to not feel like a cog in the system?
I think the first thing I would say is that young people have had a gigantic impact on climate, in my opinion. And you better stay at it, regardless of whether you're pessimistic or not. And to me, what you're not describing is pessimism. It's frustration and anger. Go for it. You know, like I've been frustrated and I've been really angry. There's been decisions I really haven't liked. Part of them I've been part of. But I went into government for that very reason. It was driving me crazy. But maybe the difference is that, you know, I'm 68. There's a lot of things that are so much better than when I was a kid. I mean, the change is just enormous. So maybe I just tend to look at that longer cycle and say that change is possible. It can happen. But frankly, if young people get so discouraged that they do get pessimistic, we won't win. We won't win. Because if we haven't figured it out yet, you're the ones that inherit the lousy stuff we do and the good stuff we do. And I don't want to be on the bad side of that equation. And I don't know many people my age that would want to. So keep getting angry, keep getting frustrated. But in the end, take a deep breath and say, what do I do now? That's all, right?
Thank you. Back to online.
Thank you. President Biden recently approved oil drilling in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. Do you agree with that or not?
And there may be limits to what our guest can address as active policy matters, but there's probably a general reaction to this question.
We have this sort of lobbying thing that we can't say too much, and I certainly am familiar with it. So that's probably all I probably should say without getting myself in wicked trouble. I don't think anybody loved that decision. Let's just say that, and that's from the top. From the top down. There were legal constraints. There's lots of things that impacted decision by that, mostly legal constraints. But I think the saving grace is that, you know, there is a lot of fossil fuels that are being taken out of the ground. We can't stop them everywhere. That can't be the scenario. We just can't do it. But if we can stop the demand for them, if we can spend this money in a way that says they're going to be the loser in this system, then that's what we have to do. We have to just say, okay, if I can't stop that, the law doesn't allow it, or a decision got made that for whatever reason, then go back and say, I'm going to make sure that fossil fuels don't win for people that I care about, that it's more expensive and that it's polluting, and we can drive it out of the system that way. That's where I think the biggest hope is.
Thank you. We will take 2 more questions and then we will wrap. So I think there was a hand here and another one somewhere in the center. There you go.
So I do have a question. So you've been doing this for over 40 years.
Yep.
If and when you do retire, like, what do you want to be remembered for?
What do I want to what?
What do you want to be remembered for?
Oh, that's a really good question. I am actually retired from the federal government. So now I'm just doing sort of consulting work. So I don't, I would like to be thought of as being a really good government employee who worked for the people, not just the law. And there's some things that I've done that I really liked better than other things. I think the Clean Power Plan is one. I had such a blast doing that. It was basically tossed aside. I didn't even care because it was the right thing to do, and also because it ended up that we got the goals that we thought we were going to get in 2030 within 3 years. So it just sent a signal. All right, so that's it. So I've done a lot of individual things, but I just want to be seen as a good person, a person who cares, like a person who is always mission driven. Because when I left the government, I started working with investment companies, and I wasn't sure whether I really wanted to do that. But I said, if I think that in order to fix climate, we need to get money to the global south, and I can't get it from Congress, I get it from somewhere else. So my mission isn't how much money can they make with those investments. My mission is that if the entire world isn't invested in climate change, in these changes, we cannot win. So I go for it. So just being a mission-driven person is probably a good thing, without being a wacko. You can be mission-driven in a whack job too, you know.
And we'll take the final question here in the front.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us. I just had a question, since I know you advised Governor Healy on her transition, and whether the Weymouth compressor station was on the table as something that you advised her to shut down, because that is a major thorn in, in the eyes of many who have been fighting for years to address climate change.
I do not know whether that was in there. All I had was my climate slice, and there were a whole bunch of other committees looking at other pieces, so I can't really answer the question. I don't know. Has she taken a position on that individually? No.
Okay. Would you like to leave us with a closing thought?
Well, first, thank you for letting me come. It was very fun to be rambling a bit. I hope I didn't ramble too much. But I love the work I do. I hope everybody stays engaged in these things. I hope nobody, diminishes the opportunity that you have in your own home, in local communities, in your state to make change. Without an active and vocal constituencies fighting in every direction, the right answers will never happen. They'll never rise. And I just hope that you stay active and try to stay positive but realistic. Relish when you make progress, It energizes you to fight against those who don't want it. And life has to be about that, right? That's it. And thank you for having me here.
No,
this
thank
is
you.
the most beautiful library. It's amazing.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Gina, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts and your experience. To all of you, thank you for attending, whether in person or online. Please keep an eye out for the recording if you'd like to revisit any parts of tonight's program. We have 3 upcoming programs in this series, as well as a bonus-related program for Pride Month in June. Coming up next on April 4th will be online only, when I'm sitting down with Alexandra Cousteau, the co-founder and president of Oceans 2050. Wawa Gatheru on May 11th, founder of Black Girl Environmentalist. And then closing out this particular series, Steve Curwood, executive producer and host of NPR's Living on Earth on June 8th. Thank you to the BPL Fund, the Lowell Institute, the GBH Forum Network, and of course the BPL programs and AV teams. Thank you all. Until next time, please be safe, be well, and good night.